Welcome back, my fellow listener. Before we begin, get comfortable, really comfortable. Settle into wherever you're lying down. If you'd like, close your eyes. Or, better yet, keep them half open and let the images on the screen do the work for you. You don't need to focus. Just let the story unfold and allow yourself to drift into it with me. You have returned, or perhaps time simply continued without you. Rome persisting in its eternal balancing act while you rested. Either way, we resume where forces long in motion finally reach their breaking point. When we paused, Rome and Persia had defeated the Mongol threat through unprecedented cooperation. The alliance had held. Trade flourished. Eastern cities welcomed Muslim merchants and scholars, and this cosmopolitan mixing seemed to suggest that Rome had learned to adapt, to include, to become something larger than its origins. But beneath this apparent harmony, tensions were accumulating that no amount of accounting precision could balance away. The slavery question that had divided East and West for centuries was approaching crisis. The religious schism between Eastern ecumenism and Western orthodoxy was widening into theological warfare. The constitutional differences between regions were creating incompatible visions of what Rome should be. For another 3 centuries, these tensions would build. Slowly at first, then faster, then catastrophically, until the moment in an Alexandria harbor when everything that had been festering would explode into violence that even the council could not ignore. This is the story of how Rome learned that some divisions cannot be balanced, only managed. How an empire that had survived for 1,500 years through adaptation finally had to admit that it had become 2 incompatible things wearing the same name. Let us continue. By 1300, the eastern and western halves of Rome had diverged dramatically in character and culture. They were held together by increasingly little beyond shared history and shared symbols. The slavery question was festering. The Eastern Senate had banned slavery empire-wide in 1355, framing it both as a moral imperative and as a practical measure to reduce tensions with Islamic states, many of whose citizens had been enslaved by Western merchants. The West refused to comply. Western economy, particularly in newer territories and in agricultural regions, depended heavily on slave labor. Western theology, shaped by a more literal interpretation of Scripture, found justifications for slavery in biblical texts. Western politicians argued that immediate abolition would cause economic collapse, would leave plantations unworked, would create chaos. And, critically, most Western slaves were not Muslim. They were captured Germanic peoples, Africans from coastal raids, prisoners of war from various conflicts. So, the Islamic justification for abolition, which resonated in the East, meant nothing in the West. The West developed an elaborate fiction. Publicly, Western governments claimed to be phasing out slavery, claimed to oppose the slave trade, claimed to be working toward abolition on a timeline that would avoid economic disruption. In reality, Western authorities supported slave merchants covertly, used legal loopholes to maintain slavery under different names, created systems of unpaid workers or indentured servants that were slavery in all but name. Eastern inspectors would arrive in Western ports and find contract laborers who lived in employer-owned housing, who could not leave their employment, who received no meaningful pay. When questioned, Western officials would insist these were voluntary arrangements, legal contracts, not slavery at all. The East knew this was a lie. But the East could not force the issue because the East needed Western military support to garrison its cities and its long frontier with Islamic territories. So, a toxic dynamic developed. Both sides knew the truth. Both sides pretended otherwise. Both sides resented each other. The East for the West's hypocrisy. The West for the East's moral posturing. This resentment built over centuries. The religious schism deepened as well. By 1500, Eastern Christianity and Western Christianity had diverged so thoroughly that they were barely recognizable as the same religion. Western Christianity had become more fundamentalist, more militant, more focused on doctrinal purity. The Western Church preached against Eastern heresy, against Islamic influence, against any compromise with theological error. It developed a theology of Western exceptionalism, an idea that true faith had fled to the West when the East corrupted itself. Eastern Christianity had become more philosophical, more ecumenical, more willing to engage with other traditions. Eastern theologians wrote treatises comparing Christian and Islamic concepts, finding common ground, building bridges. To Westerners, this looked like apostasy. To Easterners, Western rigidity looked like primitive ignorance. By 1600, the two halves of Christianity were as hostile to each other as Christianity and Islam had ever been. Technology continued to develop, but differently in East and West. True industrialization began around 1600, earlier than in the other timeline, because of continuous technological development without a civilizational collapse. But the East and West industrialized in different sectors, driven by different needs. The East, having abolished slavery, needed machinery to replace human labor in essential tasks. Eastern factories produced agricultural equipment, construction machinery, mining tools, transportation infrastructure. Eastern industrialization focused on practical applications that increased productivity in sectors that affected everyone's daily life. The West, still relying on slave labor for essential tasks, industrialized in sectors where slave labor was impractical. Western factories produced luxury goods, entertainment devices, precision instruments like clocks, printing presses for books. Western industrialization focused on specialized manufacturing for markets that could afford quality goods. Both regions became industrial, but their industrial bases were incompatible. Eastern industry made Eastern society more efficient at feeding and housing its population. Western industry made Western elites wealthier, but did not fundamentally transform how most Western people lived. By 1700, the East was measurably wealthier than the West. Living standards were higher, cities were cleaner, infrastructure was better maintained, the economy grew faster. The West was not poor, but it was falling behind, and Western populations were becoming aware of this. Western travelers to Eastern cities returned with stories of prosperity that seemed impossible. Eastern travelers to Western cities were horrified by the poverty they saw, by the slaves working in fields and factories, by the gap between wealthy elites and desperate masses. This created resentment on both sides. The East resented Western backwardness, Western refusal to modernize, Western moral failures. The West resented Eastern wealth, Eastern smugness, Eastern interference. And then, in June of 1688, in the harbor of Alexandria, everything came to a head. a Western merchant ship arrived carrying cargo that included slaves being transported from one Western territory to another. This was illegal under the empire-wide ban on slavery, but Western ships routinely ignored this law, and Eastern authorities usually looked the other way to avoid confrontation. But on this particular day, in this particular port, circumstances aligned in unfortunate ways. The Eastern Port Authority in Alexandria was under new management, a reformer who had been appointed specifically to enforce regulations that had been ignored for too long. Muslim harbor workers, aware of the ship's cargo, were angry that slavery continued despite laws against it. The ship's captain was under pressure from his company to maintain schedules, to avoid delays that would cost money and damage his reputation. When the Eastern Port Authority demanded to inspect the ship's cargo, the captain refused, claiming that the ship was Western territory and therefore not subject to Eastern jurisdiction. When inspectors attempted to board anyway, the captain made a desperate decision. He armed his crew and he armed the slaves, giving them weapons and promising them freedom if they defended the ship. It's unclear who fired first. Accounts differ. But within minutes, a full battle was occurring in Alexandria's harbor. Eastern Port Militia arrived to support the inspectors. Muslim dock workers, seeing an opportunity to free enslaved people, joined the fight. The ship's crew and the armed slaves fought back desperately. The fighting lasted less than an hour, but when it ended, 157 people were dead. The ship was burning. The captain was dead. Dozens of Eastern militia and Muslim workers were dead, and many of the slaves who had been armed to defend the ship had been killed in the crossfire. Eastern authorities arrested the surviving Western crew members for illegal slave trading in Eastern waters. They seized the cargo. They prepared prosecution. Western authorities demanded immediate release of the crew and compensation for the destroyed ship. They claimed that Eastern aggression had caused the incident, that the captain had been defending himself against illegal boarding, that the deaths were the fault of Eastern authorities who had provoked the confrontation. The Western Church declared the incident to be evidence of a Muslim Eastern conspiracy against Christian merchants. Bishops preached that the East had murdered Christians to appease their Muslim allies. Public outrage in Western territories was intense. The Eastern response was that the ship had been breaking imperial law, that the captain had started the violence by arming slaves and refusing legitimate inspection, that Western authorities were hypocrites who claimed to oppose slavery while defending slave traders. For 6 months, the two sides exchanged ultimatums. The West threatened military action if the crew was not released. The East threatened to seize all Western property in Eastern territories if the West did not cease protecting slave traders. Neither side wanted war, but both sides had mobilized populations that were demanding action. Western newspapers were printing stories about Eastern persecution of Christians. Eastern newspapers were printing stories about Western barbarity and hypocrisy. The Higher Imperial Council, which had coordinated East-West relations for centuries, called an emergency session. The Council's conclusion was stark. East and West could not continue to coexist in their current form. The tensions were too deep, the differences too fundamental, the resentments too bitter. If they remained in close contact, they would eventually destroy each other. But the Council could not force either side to change. The East would not abandon its abolitionist principles. The West would not immediately abolish slavery. The religious divide was unbridgeable, So the council proposed something unprecedented: partition. The Partition Decree of 1693 was presented not as a permanent division, but as a temporary separation to prevent catastrophe. East and West would be physically separated, given different spheres to expand into, allowed to develop according to their own values without constant friction. A demilitarized neutral zone would be created around modern-day Serbia and Bosnia, a corridor roughly 150 miles wide, controlled exclusively by the Council. Neither Eastern nor Western military forces would be allowed in the zone. To enforce this, the Council would create its own army, drawn from volunteers from both East and West, but loyal to the Council alone. This army would defend the neutral zone, would control all passage between East and West, would ensure that the partition was maintained. The West would be directed to expand westward and across the Atlantic, to explore and settle the Americas, to build an empire in territories that the East had no interest in. The East would be directed to expand eastward, deeper into Asia, to consolidate its trade empire and convert commercial influence into more formal control. All exchange between East and West would have to pass through Council-controlled ports in the neutral zone. Every transaction would require Council approval. Trade would be monitored, regulated, taxed. No civilian passage would be allowed across the border without explicit Council permission, which would be rarely granted. The slavery issue would remain unresolved. The Council would officially condemn slavery, but acknowledge that it could not enforce abolition in the West. The neutral zone itself would be slavery-free, and any slave who reached it would be automatically freed. Both East and West resented the partition. Both felt that the Council was overstepping its authority, was dividing an empire that should remain united. But both also recognized that the alternative was civil war, was the destruction of Rome in a conflict that neither side could win. The Partition Decree was implemented in 1693. The Council's army, initially small at about 5,000 troops, took control of the neutral zone. The first soldiers were veterans from both Eastern and Western forces, men who were tired of almost wars and preferred peace, even peace enforced by a third party. The military colors became symbols that people would see for the next 3 centuries. Eastern soldiers wore blue and silver, colors chosen to evoke the Mediterranean that had always been Rome's heart, colors that suggested sophistication and cosmopolitanism. Western soldiers wore red and white, traditional Roman red with white crosses added by the Western Church, colors that suggested martial virtue and religious purity. Council soldiers wore purple and gold, imperial purple that had once been reserved for emperors, and gold that suggested wealth and permanence. The purple and gold became prestigious. Council service was elite service, and soldiers who wore those colors were respected throughout the neutral zone and in the border provinces of both empires. Joint patrols became common along the borders of the neutral zone. Council soldiers would march alongside border province militia from the east or from the west, displaying combined colors, showing that the Council had the support of the provinces closest to the partition line. This was important because those border provinces, the eastern provinces of the Western Empire and the western provinces of the Eastern Empire, became deeply loyal to the Council over the following decades. People in those provinces had lived through the tensions that preceded partition. They had seen how close East and West had come to war. They understood that the Council had prevented catastrophe, and they appreciated the peace that partition brought even as populations further from the border resented it. Border province soldiers trained with Council troops regularly. Young men from these provinces volunteered for Council service in disproportionate numbers. By 1750, the Council's official standing army had grown to 10,000, but its unofficial reserve, border province militias that were effectively Council loyal, numbered perhaps 200,000. The Council had become a third power. Western exploration of the Americas began in earnest in 1695. Western ships crossed the Atlantic and reached the Caribbean, then the eastern coasts of South and North America. Western colonization was slow and brutal. The West brought technologies that native populations could not match, but the West also lacked the resources for rapid expansion. Western industry had developed in the wrong sectors. They had luxury goods and precision instruments, but they lacked the construction machinery and agricultural equipment that would have made large-scale settlement easier. So Western colonization proceeded through violence and exploitation. Native populations were enslaved where possible, driven away where they resisted, infected with European diseases that killed vast numbers. By 1900, the West controlled the Atlantic coasts of the Americas, the Caribbean, eastern South America, portions of North America's Atlantic coast. But the interior remained largely independent, inhabited by native peoples who had acquired some Roman technologies through trade and conflict, who had developed resistance to European diseases over generations of contact, who were capable of defending their territories. The Americas did not become a total Western slave colony, as Western planners had hoped, but they became a source of resources and wealth that helped Western economies survive even as they fell further behind the East. Eastern expansion into Asia began simultaneously in 1695. Eastern armies pushed eastward from their existing frontiers, encountering powerful Asian empires, Chinese dynasties, Indian, sultanates and kingdoms, Japanese powers, Southeast Asian states. The initial encounters were violent. Eastern Rome was powerful, but Asian states were not primitive or unprepared. The wars of the early 1700s were bloody stalemates. Eastern armies could not be driven out, but they could not conquer the territories they invaded either. By 1780, Eastern leadership had concluded that military conquest was impractical and unnecessarily expensive. A different strategy emerged. Instead of conquering, the East would infiltrate. Instead of destroying Asian political structures, the East would manipulate them. The embassy system developed. Permanent Eastern diplomatic missions were established in Beijing, Delhi, Tokyo, and other Asian capitals. These embassies were not merely diplomatic. They were centers of influence, of intelligence gathering, of economic penetration. Eastern merchants operating through these embassies established monopolies on certain trade goods. Eastern banks offered loans to Asian rulers at favorable rates, then used debt as leverage. Eastern advisors were welcomed at Asian courts, where they shaped policy in ways that benefited Rome. Eastern education became prestigious. Asian elites sent their children to Constantinople and other Eastern cities to study. These children returned home fluent in Eastern Latin, familiar with Roman administration, often more loyal to Rome than to their own states. By 1900, the East did not formally control most of Asia, but it effectively ruled Asian trade networks and dominated Asian politics. Asian states remained nominally independent, but they could not act contrary to Eastern interests without suffering economic punishment. Eastern Latin became the language of commerce and diplomacy across Asia, just as it was across the Mediterranean. To be educated in Asia increasingly meant to be educated in Roman institutions, to speak Eastern Latin, to adopt Roman commercial practices. This was empire without conquest, control through influence rather than through military occupation. The Council Zone, meanwhile, had become something unique. The neutral zone around Serbia and Bosnia had started as a buffer, a controlled border between hostile powers. But over decades, it developed its own character. Refugees fled to the Council Zone. Eastern Christians who disagreed with Eastern theology, Western Christians fleeing Western church persecution, Muslims facing discrimination in either empire, freed slaves escaping from the West. The Council accepted them because population growth increased the zone's wealth and power. More people meant more tax revenue, more soldiers for the Council army, more justification for the Council's existence. By 1800, the Council Zone was a cosmopolitan mixture unlike anywhere else. Eastern Latin and Western Latin were both spoken fluently. Arabic was common. Multiple forms of Christianity coexisted. Muslims practiced openly. Freed slaves and their descendants formed communities, and the Council taxed all of it. Every transaction between East and West passed through Council-controlled ports and paid Council tariffs. As trade volume increased, and it increased dramatically as both Eastern and Western economies grew, Council revenue soared. The Council used this wealth strategically. They built the best universities, attracting top students from both East and West, with scholarships and promises of intellectual freedom. Council universities became centers of innovation, places where Eastern and Western knowledge combined, where scholars could work without political interference. This created brain drain from both empires. The best engineers, the best scientists, the best minds increasingly moved to the Council Zone, where they could earn better salaries, access better facilities, and work with other brilliant people, regardless of whether they were Eastern or Western. The Council also developed a system of innovation restriction that was presented as safety regulation, but functioned as knowledge extraction. Any new technology that either East or West wanted to trade to the other had to be submitted to the Council for safety inspection. Council inspectors would examine the technology, test it, evaluate it. Officially, this was to ensure that dangerous technologies did not cross borders and destabilize peace. Actually, the Council reverse-engineered everything that passed through their inspection process. Whatever innovations the East developed, the Council learned and kept. Whatever innovations the West developed, the Council learned and kept. And because the Council had attracted the best minds from both empires, they often improved on the technologies they examined. By 1900, the Council Zone was technologically ahead of both East and West, despite being much smaller in territory and population. The 20th century in this timeline did not see the world wars that scarred the other timeline. The partition system worked. East and West remained separated. When tensions rose, and they rose periodically, over trade disputes or ideological conflicts or perceived insults, the Council intervened before things escalated to violence. In 1914, a border incident that might have triggered war was resolved when the Council deployed 50,000 troops to both sides of the neutral zone and made clear that any attack would be met with council force. In 1936, Eastern economic sanctions against Western territories over continued slavery created a crisis that the council mediated through months of negotiation, finding compromises that neither side liked, but both could accept. The conflicts happened elsewhere. The East fought pacification, campaigns in Asia, suppressing independence movements, crushing resistance to Roman economic dominance. The West fought against native resistance in the Americas, pushing further into the interior, establishing plantations and mining operations on land taken from people who had lived there for millennia. But East and West did not fight each other, and Rome did not tear itself apart. Technology accelerated through the 19th and 20th centuries. Both East and West developed steam power, then electricity, then internal combustion engines, then more sophisticated technologies. But the innovations continued to reflect the different characters of the two empires. Eastern innovation focused on infrastructure, on systems, on technologies that made society function more efficiently. Eastern engineers developed better railways, better power grids, better communications networks. Western innovation focused on specialized applications, on precision, on technologies that served specific markets. Western engineers developed better weapons, better luxury goods, better entertainment technologies. And the Council, taking innovations from both sides and improving them, developed the technologies that would define the modern world. Computing emerged in Council universities in the 1950s. The first computers were built to perform complex calculations for trade optimization, for modeling economic relationships between East and West, for code breaking. The Internet developed in Council research facilities in the 1970s. It was designed originally as a communication system linking Council universities and government offices, but it spread rapidly as businesses recognized its utility. By 2000, the Council developed Internet connected the entire Roman world and extended into territories beyond Rome's formal control. The protocols were designed in the Council zone. The infrastructure was managed by Council authorities. The dominant languages on the network were Eastern Latin and Western Latin in roughly equal proportions. Autonomous vehicles emerged from Council universities in the early 21st century. The technology combined Eastern expertise in infrastructure systems with Western precision engineering and Council software development. By 2020, self-driving cars were common in major cities throughout the empire. All of this technology was licensed to East and West at prices that ensured Council prosperity. Neither East nor West could refuse these licenses. To remain competitive, to maintain modern living standards, both empires needed the technologies that the Council controlled. So they paid the fees, accepted the terms, and resented the dependence. When I returned to the year 2026, I returned to a world that was both recognizable and strange. The Roman Empire still existed. It had persisted for nearly 1,800 years since I had planted the seed of double entry, bookkeeping. It had not fallen, had not collapsed, had not been replaced by successor states, but it had become three things that shared a name. I went first to Rome itself, the ancient capital, now the capital of the Western Empire. The city was a mixture of old and new in jarring combinations. Ancient buildings, classical architecture from before the partition, stood preserved and beautiful, but not modernized. They were museums, essentially, monuments to a past that Western society claimed to honor but no longer fully inhabited. Buildings constructed by Western architects and engineers in the centuries after partition were functional but uninspired, aging poorly, not well maintained. Western society had built what it needed, but without aesthetic ambition, without the confidence that comes from cultural vitality. And then there were the council buildings, constructed in the last few decades as council companies had won contracts to build infrastructure that Western companies could not handle. These were sleek, modern, obviously superior in design and function. They stood out dramatically, reminders of Western dependency. The streets were full of autonomous vehicles, all of them displaying Council Autonomous Systems logos, all of them licensed from council corporations. Western manufacturers had tried to compete in this market and failed. Western industry, having developed in the wrong sectors centuries earlier, still could not produce the advanced systems that modern life required. Western soldiers were everywhere, wearing red and white uniforms, many of them smoking, lounging against buildings, visibly bored. They carried traditional weapons, rifles, some outdated armored vehicles, and projected an aggressive masculinity that felt compensatory. They were defending nothing, facing no real threat, but they maintained the appearance of martial readiness, as though readiness itself was the point. Council police operated in major districts, wearing purple and gold, professional and disciplined. They used non-lethal technologies, managed traffic, responded to emergencies with efficiency that Western police forces could not match. The Western soldiers hated them. The contempt was visible. Western soldiers would smoke deliberately near council officers, would make comments just loud enough to be heard, would refuse to coordinate even when cooperation would be easier for everyone. But there was no violence. Both sides knew that the council would win any conflict, and Western soldiers, however much they resented council presence, were not suicidal. The social atmosphere was bitter. Public art celebrated Western values and true Christianity. Graffiti proclaimed council thieves and Eastern heretics. Occasional messages calling for reunification appeared, but they meant Western-led reunification, the reconquest of the East, not actual reconciliation. Unemployment was high, perhaps 15%. Young Western Romans were leaving for the council zone in search of work, and older generations saw this as betrayal. The Western Church was everywhere. Services were broadcast on public screens. Bishops appeared in news programs commenting on political events. Religious police enforced decency laws, dress codes, restrictions on behavior that the church considered immoral. And slavery persisted, though not called slavery. Official documents referred to contract labor and indentured service. In reality, about 8% of the Western population lived in conditions indistinguishable from slavery, unable to leave employment, living in employer-owned housing, receiving minimal or no meaningful pay. Eastern media constantly showed this as evidence of Western barbarism. Western media claimed that Eastern wage slavery was worse, though this was obvious false equivalence, propaganda designed to justify the unjustifiable. I left Rome and traveled to Constantinople. The contrast was immediately visible. Constantinople felt confident in ways that Rome did not. The city had been rebuilt and modernized over centuries, and the modernization felt integrated rather than imposed. Buildings blended classical Eastern Roman architecture, domes, columns, with modern materials and smart systems. The aesthetic was coherent, suggesting a society that knew what it valued and built accordingly. The technology was as advanced as in Rome, but the urban planning was better. Eastern bureaucrats had designed Constantinople's infrastructure for efficiency, and it showed. Public transit moved smoothly. Streets were clean. Services functioned reliably. The population was obviously diverse. Eastern Latin was spoken, but so were Arabic, Persian, Greek, various Asian languages. Perhaps 70% of the population spoke at least 2 languages fluently. This was a society that valued multilingualism, that saw engagement with other cultures as sophistication rather than contamination. Eastern soldiers wore blue and silver, professional and disciplined, carrying advanced weapons but not displaying them aggressively. Perhaps a quarter of the soldiers I saw were Muslim, integrated into units alongside Christian soldiers, all of them simply Roman soldiers regardless of their religion. There were no council police in Constantinople. The East maintained its sovereignty more successfully than the West, administered its own cities, policed its own populations. The social atmosphere was cosmopolitan pride mixed with frustration. Public art celebrated universal Roman civilization, incorporating Christian, Islamic, and Asian themes. The message was that Rome was larger than any single culture, that true Roman identity was about inclusion and adaptation. But underneath this confidence was awareness that the system was unsustainable. Asian independence movements were growing. The Eastern Empire's control over Asian trade networks was being challenged by Asian nationalists who no longer accepted Roman dominance, however economically beneficial it might be. Young Easterners discussed this openly in cafes and universities. Was the Asian Empire ethical? Was it sustainable? Should Rome withdraw and allow Asian self-determination? These were questions that previous generations had not asked, questions that suggested the Eastern Empire was entering a period of self-doubt about its own foundations. I went finally to Concordia, the council's own capital. It was the most advanced city I saw. Fully automated infrastructure managed by artificial intelligence, quantum computing networks that neither East nor West had yet deployed, medical technologies years ahead of what was available elsewhere, architecture designed by the world's best architects, drawn from every culture Rome had touched, combining influences in ways that created something new rather than merely mixing old things. The population was genetically mixed after 3 centuries of refugees from everywhere converging in neutral territory. There was no dominant ethnicity, no dominant culture beyond the council's own cosmopolitan pragmatism. Everyone spoke both Eastern Latin and Western Latin, usually fluently. Many spoke 3 or 4 additional languages. The society was multilingual by default, and this created a psychological distance from the tribalism of East and West. Council citizens saw themselves as post-Roman. They held Roman passports, lived under Roman law, benefited from Roman citizenship. But they did not see themselves as participants in the cultural conflicts that defined Eastern and Western identities. The wealth was visible everywhere. Per capita income in the council zone was nearly 50% higher than in the East and more than double the West. This was funded by trade taxes, technology licensing fees, and university tuition from international students who paid premium rates to study in the world's best institutions. Critics in both East and West called the council parasitic, claimed it profited from their productivity, without creating value itself. Council citizens responded that they created value by preventing East and West from destroying each other, that peace was a service worth paying for. The council military was visible but subtle. 10,000 soldiers in purple and gold. Elite troops who were ceremonial most of the time but capable of combat, if necessary. Everyone knew that these 10,000 could summon 200,000 from border provinces within days if the council's authority was challenged. I spoke with people in all 3 regions, asking questions, trying to understand what the world I had created actually felt like to the people living in it. In the West, I spoke with a factory worker in his 50s who told me his son had moved to Concordia for work. I told him, "Go then, betray your faith and your people for money." He went anyway. He sends money home sometimes. I don't want it. The bitterness was profound, personal, rooted in the sense that his own family was dissolving, because the council offered opportunities that the West could not match. I spoke with a Western university student, a young woman studying engineering, who was trying to decide whether to apply for scholarships in Concordia. Everyone says I should go. The education is better, the jobs are better, I'll make more money. But my church says I'm abandoning my community, that the council corrupts everyone who goes there. I don't know what to do. In the East, I spoke with a merchant who traded with Asia, who had offices in Constantinople and Delhi. The system works, he told me. We're prosperous, we're sophisticated, we've built something remarkable. But I wonder sometimes whether we've just replaced conquest with manipulation. We control Asia without admitting we control it. Is that better, or just more dishonest? I spoke with an Eastern University professor, a theologian who studied the history of Christian-Islamic relations. Western Christianity and Eastern Christianity are different religions now, she said. They use the same words but mean different things. Reunification would require one side to abandon its entire understanding of faith. That's not compromise. That's surrender. So reunification will never happen, and we should stop pretending it will. In Concordia, I spoke with a council, bureaucrat responsible for technology licensing, a man in his 40s who had been born in the West, educated in the East, and settled in the council zone. People accuse us of stealing technology, he said. But we're not stealing. We're preventing either side from gaining advantages that would destabilize the partition. If the East developed quantum computing alone, the West would panic. If the West developed autonomous weapons alone, the East would respond. We take innovations from both sides and develop them ourselves, then license them equally. It's not theft. It's peacekeeping through technological parity. I asked him whether he ever wanted to return to the West where he was born. Return to what? He said. The West is my history, not my future. I'm grateful for where I came from, but I wouldn't go back. Why would I? I asked people in all 3 regions whether they wanted reunification, whether they believed Rome should be one empire again. The answers were illuminating in their similarity, despite coming from completely different perspectives. An Eastern senator told me, "Of course, we should reunify, but only when the West modernizes, abandons slavery, accepts that the East represents Rome's future. Until then, partition is necessary." A Western bishop told me, "Of course, we should reunify, but only when the East returns to true Christianity, acknowledges its heresy, accepts Western theological authority. Until then, separation preserves our faith." a council official told me. Of course, reunification is our long-term goal, but the process must be carefully managed, gradually implemented, thoroughly studied. We facilitate dialogue toward this end. All three meant no, but none could say it directly, because Rome still meant something, even if no one could agree what. The empire had survived by becoming three incompatible things, held together by shared symbols, and the pretense that separation was temporary. The psychological weight of this was profound. People in all three regions lived with contradictions that could not be fully resolved. Easterners were proud of their prosperity and sophistication, but frustrated by their dependency on council technology and by the growing awareness that their Asian empire was morally indefensible. Westerners were proud of their religious purity and martial traditions, but humiliated by their poverty and technological backwardness, resentful that their children were leaving for better opportunities elsewhere. Council citizens were proud of their advancement and cosmopolitanism, but aware that their prosperity was built on taxing others, on preventing the very reunification they claimed to facilitate. No one was satisfied. Everyone was trapped in arrangements that had calcified over centuries, that no one had chosen but everyone was forced to inhabit. I had not created this. I had only planted a seed, introduced a tool, given Rome a way to track its resources more accurately. Rome had taken that tool and used it to survive, and in surviving, Rome had learned to balance everything: income against expenditure, east against west, unity against division, continuity against change. The balance was stable. It had lasted for centuries. It would probably last for centuries more. But it was not peace. It was frozen conflict, managed tension, resentment organized into sustainable forms. Different people on different thrones, different empires with different values, same human patterns in different configurations. In the other timeline, Rome had collapsed in the West around 476 CE. The collapse had been traumatic, had destroyed knowledge, had created centuries of fragmentation and warfare. But the collapse had also allowed new things to emerge: nation-states, different political philosophies, the possibility of imagining organization beyond empire. Here, Rome had never collapsed. Rome had endured. Rome had adapted. Rome had become immortal through bureaucratic sophistication and institutional memory that stretched across 18 centuries. Whether this was better, I could not say. The people who lived here did not know what the alternative might have been. They only knew Rome, eternal Rome, Rome that balanced its books and balanced everything else into permanent continuation. I had removed the fiscal crisis that might have killed Rome in the 3rd century. I had given Rome the tools to persist. And Rome, having learned to count what it could not afford to lose, had learned to preserve itself at any cost. Even the cost of never being able to change, never being able to let go, never being able to imagine what might exist beyond the system that had sustained itself for so long. I did not save Rome. I made it impossible to kill, and in doing so, I created an empire that would outlive its purpose, outlive its vitality, outlive the love of its own citizens, simply because it had learned to balance its accounts too well to ever declare bankruptcy. Forever is a long time to be stable and miserable, but stability compounds, and Rome had 18 centuries of compounding stability behind it. The empire would continue. The partition would hold. The council would extract wealth from both sides. East and West would resent each other and resent the council and pretend that someday they would reunify. And nothing would fundamentally change, because change would unbalance the books, and Rome had learned above all else never to allow that. I returned to my own time, to the world I had left, carrying the knowledge of what I had created. Different people on different thrones, same mistakes in different languages, but eternal, balanced, persistent. Rome forever, trapped in the system that saved it.